David is king of Judah, and Ishbosheth is king of the rest of Israel, thanks to Abner, Saul's cousin, who really didn't like David at all. I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Thanks for joining us. Today we're studying 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 12 to 17. Verse 12 tells us that Abner left Mahanaim, where he had installed Ishbosheth as king, and headed to Gibeon. He took along with him Ishbosheth's servants. Meanwhile, Joab and the servants of David got word of it and went out to meet them at the pool of Gibeon. And they all had a meeting. In fact, the text says they all sat down, Abner's team on one side of the pool and Joab's team on the other side. One may well say that this was the first recorded bilateral talks. They weren't peace talks, though. In fact, they were talks in which Abner suggested to Joab that there be a contest between the young men of each side. And Joab, always game for something like this, readily agreed. Now, based on his own research, commentator Chuck Smith says this about Joab. There's very little to be admired in Joab, he says. In fact, Joab was a very cruel and difficult person, tough as nails. David tolerated him because he had such tremendous devotion to David, and he was such a tremendous fighter. But David never was really comfortable with Joab because of the nature of the fellow. So what we read here isn't at all commendable or pleasant, or it just shows really the corrupt nature of man. End of quote. Well, you can decide for yourself. David Gusick, on the other hand, collaborates much of Smith's thinking when he says the following, quote, Joab was apparently one of the 400 men who joined David at Adullam cave. We read about that or studied about it in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. Or he joined with David during this general period. Joab had two notable brothers, Abishai and Asahel. So Joab, Abishai, and Asahel were David's nephews, the sons of David's sister, Zeruiah. We'll read about that in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 16, but you can move on ahead and check it out for yourself. 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 16. And finally, Joab had a long and checkered career as David's chief general, says Gusick. Gusick also suggests that Abner was cut from the same cloth. The NAT suggests that Abner's idea was that they be invited or challenged to play. What is in view here is a gladiator type of event or contest in which representative groups of soldiers, most likely the younger ones, engage in mortal combat before the watching armies. The New American Bible says, perform for us. The NASB, the New American Standard Bible, says, have a contest before us. And the New Living Translation says, put on an exhibition of hand-to-hand combat. So 12 Benjamites, contesting on behalf of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and 12 servants of David engage in battle. The text describes the fighting quite well. Each seized his opponent by the head and then thrust his sword in his opponent's side, so that they both went down together. The NAT goes a little further. It suggests that both members of each pair of fighters use the same tactic, seizing the other's head and stabbing the other with their sword, to the point that the NET ends the verse by saying, quote, they fell dead together, end of quote. Now that's all in verse 16, but it isn't until verse 17 where we find out who won. Well, no one actually won the battle between the 12 men on one side and the 12 men on the other side. The rest of verse 16 tells us that because of this contest, this place in Gibeon was called Helkath Haz Urim, or the field of sword edges. The NAT Bible translates it as the field of flints. Other translations include field of sides, field of adversaries, and field of daggers. Verse 17 tells us the resulting battle was very severe, and Abner's soldiers were beaten by the servants of David in the bloodbath that followed. Think of it as a fight that breaks out at an arena among the opposing fans at a hockey match after the game was over. Abner's men fled and David's men won. In summary, we note that in this battle, the side led by Abner in support of a king not anointed by God was indeed the aggressor side. The location of the battle was Gibeon, in the lot belonging to Benjamin, where Saul had had most of his friends. So perhaps it was some unfair territory. And the pool between them gave them an opportunity to think and to take time to deliberate. And Matthew Henry wisely reminds us that regardless of how this thing began, who started it, and that it was meant to simply be a game with a purpose, it ended in a draw between the sides, and thus the totality of both armies now had to engage in order to resolve the matter. And that ended in the loss of many lives, a bloodbath. The challengers took the loss, and God's side won. So what are we to take from all this? Well, here are some of my thoughts. I hope you will share some of yours. First, never lose sight of your relatives or the friends of those who oppose you. By marriage, Abner, a big supporter of Saul who wanted David dead, was David's relative by marriage. This was Abner's chance to deliver that wish of defeating and ultimately doing away with David for his dead master Saul. Second, be careful who you put forward from your side to represent you in any type of talks or negotiation. You may be greatly disappointed. That is, assuming David was informed of this little arrangement. Joab was a rogue, and he'd easily agree to deadly games, risking the lives of others. When either suggesting a life and death game like this or accepting the challenge, we need to take time first to consider the strategy, especially the exit strategy or the end play. Consider all the possibilities. Who would have thought a tie would have been one of the outcomes, and as such a further, broader, more deadly event had to take place? This was no Goliath versus David, winner take all. This was both sides completely dead. Now what? Third, never challenge an opponent unless you are confident you can beat them. It's usually best in God's battlefields to be the reactor rather than the aggressor. The odds of God being on your side are greater in that case, in my personal experience. Next time, we're going to look at a personal tragedy that ensued as Abner and his men were fleeing. Join us for that. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please write to us. Send us your comments, your questions, your thoughts. Share these videos with others. And above all, keep on studying God's Word. There's gems in there that are so valuable to our life today.